Resuming our discussion of Syria at the end of World War II, we mentioned that these four states were created. Looking at the map of Syria, now you're beginning to see Syria in the context of a broader Middle East, and then the next map really focuses more on Syria itself. Now, ruling directly as they did, it meant that the French really never tried or to train a good indigenous army for Syrian because they didn't want that army to threaten them. So therefore, as we move toward the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Syrians had a ragtag of an army, and the Syrian force, if you could call it that, were the least effective force. The most effective one were two. One was the Arab Legion in Jordan, and the other was the Iraqi army, which was by far the best, but that one really sat out the war. And the Arab Legion didn't get involved that heavily. Now, because of that, many Arabs regard this defeat of 1948 war with Israel as a British orchestration. They argue that the British put the Jews in Palestine and then prevented Arabs' strongest armies to fight the Israelis. Be that as it may, the Syrians are truly humiliated in the 1948 war. They enter that war ill-prepared, and after the war, there's much instability in the country. In fact, there are a series of coups that take place. Now, most Arabs believe that what was happening at the time was an important rivalry developing between the United States and Britain, of all the powers. On the side of the United States, according to this scenario, you had the Saudi Arabia and you had Egypt. At that time, around 1950s, early 50s, the Wafd party was strongly anti-British, and the United States really began to play with the opposition forces there. On the British side, you had the Hashemite brothers, one in Jordan, Abdullah, and the other one in Iraq. That was Faisal, who was deposed from his kingdom in Syria, but the British gave him Iraq as his new kingdom. So what's happening after 1948 till in about 1949, in that very brief period, you have a series of bewildering coups in which, as I said, many Arabs begin to regard as the United States and British rivalry for the control of the Middle East. Now, at first, I must confess that I was skeptical and inclined to dismiss this type of talk as really conspiracy theory in action. But there was a book by a former CIA agent by the name of Miles Copeland. The name of the book is Games of Nations: The Immorality of Power Politics. And in that book, he really pretty much indicates that there are substance to that kind of a rivalry. From 1949 till 1945, we actually have a period of relative stability, and that is marked by a dictatorship of one colonel by the name of Shishakli. He was a very tough dictator and was largely viewed by the Arab populace as being an American client. However, from 1954 till 1957, some very important things happened. And this is a very interesting period because after 1954, when Shishakli is deposed, we get a free coalition government in Syria. The government is nationalistic. There's a lot of free press. And it's truly a very, very exciting period. This period, you could call that the democratic period in Syria. Remember, I said throughout the Middle East, if you look, whether it's in Arab or Iran, you will find that there were fledgling democracy that had emerged, and yet they became quickly the target of the United States and the imperial powers, British and France. And so in the case of Syria, this is the period of democratic rule. As I said, it's fiercely nationalistic, and Syria at this stage, if you remember now, this is also the beginning of Cold War, and a lot of the Cold War is being played out in the Middle East. Syria is put under intense pressure, especially by United States and Britain, to join the Baghdad Pact. And remember, the Baghdad Pact was a kind of a mini version of a NATO at the regional level in the Middle East. It would have meant that Syria would have to join the United States and Britain, the imperial power, although United States was not officially part of the Baghdad Pact. It was being run by British. And it was also very clear that there is no way this democratic nationalistic government is going to accept that. In fact, they're going to reject that. Now, at this juncture in Syria's history, in terms of their hatred, you could say that the number one hatred was against the French, understandably, followed by the British as being number two. With respect to the United States, the best way to characterize their attitude was one of ambivalence. And the political picture that you have in this exciting period that I'm mentioning, that emerges from these 3 years of 1954 to 1957, is probably best captured in terms of the political parties that dominated the politics of Syria. So I want to discuss that briefly. In terms of political parties, the first one was Sha'ab. This is a very nationalistic and very conservative, it's pro-Hashemite political party, followed by Syria nationalist. Again, remember that this is not an Arab nationalist, rather it is a Syrian nationalist, and the target countries is the greater Syria, and actually the target country for them is Syria and Iraq uniting together, and for some even Palestine. So what they were calling for was a unification of Syria, Iraq, and they were pushing for that. This was very strong party. It was really territorial-based nationalism. That is, the territory that they identified as heart of the Arab nation was to be unified. It did attract a lot of intellectuals, especially a lot of Christians. The next party was Akhwani, which is essentially the Muslim Brotherhood. They were strong then, but they became much stronger as an opposition party to the rulers of Syria circa 1970s and 1980s, and their influence continues, even though, as we will discuss shortly, they become a target of Hafiz al-Assad in 1980. And a lot of them gets massacred. The next party is the Arab Socialist. The Arab Socialist Party was created by Akram Hourani. He had a charismatic potential, but the way things turned out, he really never realized it. And then the next party is the Ba'ath Political Party. This is a very important party. Its leader, its founder really was Michel Aflaq. He was the real founder. He was an Orthodox Christian, a kind of Fabian socialist, a kind of socialist who believes in gradual change rather than a revolutionary one. Aflaq was very liberal, and he does have allies. One of them is Bitar. Bitar is a Sunni Muslim. And the other ally of Aflaq is, of course, Hurani, the Arab socialist. And you will see that later on they'll merge. Finally, the last party in that period that I mentioned, the democratic period, where you have a coalition government, were the communists, Syrian Communist Party. It's a very vigorous and exciting party. It is headed actually by one Baktash, who happens to be a Kurd. Lots of the best intellectuals in Syria end up joining that party, and it was in sharp contrast to the Communist Party of Egypt, which was not very popular. It didn't attract a lot of intellectuals, and if you recall, I mentioned, in my view, the reason was that the head of the Communist Party of Egypt was a Jew, so this is the time when Palestine is becoming important, so he couldn't attract the intellectuals. But by contrast to the Egyptian Communist Party, the Syrian Communist Party was exceedingly popular. Again, going back to the period under discussion, I want to point out that this is a period of great intellectual and political vitality, not just in Syria, but all over the Middle East. The urban population were becoming politically participant, and they were beginning to be much more active. And part of that participation was the development of their sense of nationality and their sense of commitment to the very cause of Arab nationalism, especially given their treatment at the hands of the imperial power and their betrayal by them. But also remember, the period 1954 and 57 is also a period during which the Suez Crisis began in 1956. It is also a period in which United States foreign policy is undergoing real deep soul searching, and at the end of that period, the Eisenhower Doctrine is going to get promulgated, and of course it's going to get implemented. And we mentioned earlier, during this period, at the end of this period, the United States policy toward Middle East becomes crystallized. Saying a few more words about this period, if you go to Jordan in this period, King Hussein, up to 1957, had been a constitutional monarch, and you have a period of democracy under Nabulsi, Prime Minister Nabulsi in Jordan. But by 1957, when we get to Jordan, we'll discuss that in greater detail, you have a coup, a royal coup, very, very similar to the coup that we had in Iran, and King Hussein now, from being a constitutional monarch, becomes a royal dictator. Now remember, Syria is a close ally of Egypt during this period, and they refused to join the Baghdad Pact, as Nasser had urged them. So, given that proximity and kind of alliance between the two, with the success of the coup in Jordan, we next set our eyes on Syria as a part of our plan to implement the Eisenhower Doctrine. So what we're trying to do in Syria is to pull a coup there too. So we recruit one Siraj, who happens to be important intelligence officers in Syria's intelligence, and King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia gave Siraj a large sum of money on our instruction, and Siraj accepted the money, but went and told Nasser exactly what we were up to and what was happening. In other words, we had recruited the wrong person. He happened to be an Arab nationalist, and he took the money from the Saudi Arabia and let Nasser know what was happening. And guess who we were going to, if the coup had succeeded, guess who we were going to place in as the new dictator? It was going to be none other than Shishakli, who had ruled during the from 49 to 54. The whole coup operation was closely monitored by the Syrian intelligence, and every detail of it was broadcasted on the radio as the coup was taking place. So it was a fiasco of the kind that was kind of sobering for the CIA, because up to that point, CIA thought that it was omnipotent. It could pull anything it wants. And this failure really opened their eyes. So the coup ends up failing magnanimously, but in failing, the consequence of the failed coup also severely destabilized and fragmented the Syrian coalition government. And the fragmentation had to do with what to do next. The whole delicate balance that had held this coalition together became unglued, and the government, the whole system was now upset. The conservative elements were implicated in the coup, and so they were greatly and instantly delegitimized. And for a while it looked like as if Syria was going to go communist. And one thing I could say about the Syrian coup, there are some important lessons to be learned from that failure. It provides an excellent case study of what happens when you fail in attempting to bring about covert political engineering, especially of a society that you know very little about. So it upset the whole balance. Siraj, the important actor in this coup that revealed it, and other Ba'ath Party members, they decided to go to Egypt and seek Nasser's help. And essentially they said, we got to form a union with Egypt. Simultaneously, the communist members of the coalition, their belief was that they're going to need a superpower mentor because we're fighting another superpower, United States. So they went to Moscow and asked for Soviet intervention. So you have a split among the coalition members, one seeking Soviet Union intervention, the other staying with Arab nationalists and asking Nasser for help. It's worth mentioning that Nasser was very reluctant initially to forge the union, but then he began to realize the danger of Syria going communist. So now you end up with this exquisite irony. Nasser and his Syrian ally end up suppressing the communists and the Communist Party in order to save Syria from going communist, and in the process saving US the embarrassment of confronting the loss of Syria to communism. Notice the very target of Eisenhower doctrine, the Cold War doctrine, which essentially was designed to isolate Nasser, because we saw Nasser as a Soviet satellite. That very target is the one who ends up saving Syria from going communist. And not only they save Syria from going communist, they go with vengeance after the very powerful Communist Party of Syria.